Waitress pays for a guy's lunch every day. Unaware he's a millionaire and falls in love with her. Comment below where you're enjoying this story from. The last text message from her father still haunted Rachel Chen's dreams. Money is everything, sweetheart. Remember that. She'd read it standing in the marble-floored lobby of Mount Sinai Hospital minutes before learning he'd taken his own life rather than face the consequences of his crimes. 3 years later, that message remained unopened, a digital ghost in a phone she couldn't bring herself to replace. Rachel adjusted her name tag in the streaked mirror of the Golden Corner Diner's employee bathroom. The laminated plastic declared her simply Rachel. No hint of the MBA from Yale, no trace of the Chen family's notorious downfall, and certainly no suggestion of the millions still hidden in offshore accounts. She smoothed her hands over the coffee-stained apron, a familiar ritual that grounded her in this chosen reality. The pre-dawn air carried October's first real bite as she unlocked the diner's front door. This building, with its peeling paint and flickering neon, had once been part of her father's vast portfolio, another acquisition to be stripped and flipped. Now it served as her self-imposed penance, a daily reminder of the lives he'd ruined in his relentless pursuit of wealth. Through the grimy windows, she watched Martin, one of their regular homeless visitors, huddle deeper into his tattered military jacket. The sight triggered the familiar ache in her chest. Not pity, but recognition. They were both hiding in plain sight, both carrying burdens invisible to the passing world. She'd learned his story over countless cups of coffee. Decorated veteran, successful business owner, until a combination of PTSD and her father's predatory lending practices had cost him everything. "You're early again, Miss Rachel," called Mr. Wu from the kitchen, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years behind the same grill. He was another of her father's victims, though he didn't know the daughter of David Chen now served tables in his struggling diner. The old man had refused to sell during the original takeover attempt, only to lose everything in the bankruptcy proceedings that followed. Rachel had anonymously arranged for him to regain ownership, but the guilt still sat heavy in her stomach every morning. She began her opening routine, brewing coffee, filling salt shakers, counting out her register. Each task a small act of redemption, each moment an opportunity to prove that money wasn't everything, that there were other ways to measure a life's worth. Outside, the city was stirring to life, unaware that one of its wealthiest heiresses was preparing to serve them $2 coffee with a side of absolution. Marcus Shaw hadn't slept in 36 hours. The blue light of his penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows painted harsh shadows across his designer furniture, all carefully selected by the interior decorator his now ex-wife had hired. Everything in the room, like everything in his life, felt curated for someone else's approval. He loosened his tie, a habit from board meetings he couldn't shake even alone, and stared at the latest headline on his tablet. Tech mogul's perfect life unravels. Shaw Industries CEO faces personal setbacks. Perfect life. The phrase made him want to laugh or maybe throw up. His marriage of 8 years had been a carefully orchestrated business merger. He saw that now. Caroline had played her role flawlessly, using their relationship to broker deals and position herself in the industry. Even their adopted son Jamie had stopped calling once the trust fund kicked in. The last text message from the boy he'd thought of as his own read simply, "Thanks for everything. Living my best life in Europe." The morning sun crept across the city's skyline, reminding Marcus he'd spent another night lost in bitter thoughts. His PR team wanted him at charity galas, schmoozing with socialites, showing the world that Silicon Valley's most eligible bachelor was thriving post-divorce. Instead, he found himself driving aimlessly through the city's quieter streets, seeking something real in a world that felt increasingly artificial. The Golden Corner Diner caught his eye only because it looked so defiantly unchanged by time. No trendy renovations, no artisanal coffee signs, just honest fluorescent lighting and windows that had seen decades of life pass by. Marcus parked his Porsche around the corner, suddenly self-conscious of its gleaming newness in this neighborhood. Inside, the aroma of coffee and bacon wrapped around him like a forgotten memory. He chose a corner booth, away from the handful of early morning regulars. A waitress approached, young, but with eyes that carried an old soul's weight. Her name tag read Rachel, written in slightly faded marker. "Coffee to start?" she asked, her voice carrying neither the forced cheerfulness of chain restaurants nor the jaded tone of someone just waiting for their shift to end. There was something else there, something that made Marcus look twice. Before he could respond, the door chimed. A man in tattered clothes stumbled in, his face gaunt with hunger. Marcus watched, expecting the usual urban dance of shooing away unwanted visitors. Instead, Rachel turned to the man with genuine warmth. "Morning, David," she said, as if greeting an old friend. "Rough night?" The man nodded, shame and hunger warring on his face. "Kitchen made extra breakfast today," Rachel continued smoothly. "Would hate to see it go to waste. Have a seat by the window. The sun's nice there this time of morning." The interaction struck Marcus like a thunderbolt. In his world, every kindness came with strings attached, every generous gesture had an agenda, but here was something different, something real. He watched as Rachel served the homeless man with the same dignity she showed other customers, noticed how she slipped extra bacon onto his plate when she thought no one was looking. Throughout his breakfast, Marcus observed similar small acts of grace. Rachel knew every regular's name, their stories, their struggles. She treated the retired teacher counting quarters for his coffee with the same respect she showed the businessman in his tailored suit. When an elderly woman's hands shook too much to handle her coffee cup, Rachel quietly switched it to a paper cup with a lid, preserving the woman's dignity without making a show of help. The chef, Mr. Wu, Marcus gathered from the easy banter, emerged from the kitchen occasionally, his lined face creasing with genuine smiles at Rachel's gentle teasing. There was a rhythm here, a dance of genuine human connection that made Marcus's world of corporate power plays and strategic alliances feel hollow. A plan began to form in his mind. He'd built his tech empire on understanding human behavior, on testing hypotheses and gathering data. Here was a hypothesis worth testing. Was this waitress's kindness genuine, or just another carefully crafted performance? In a world where his own adopted son had turned out to be playing a long con, could anyone's goodness be trusted? The irony of testing someone's authenticity through deception didn't escape him. But as he paid his bill, leaving a tip that made Rachel's eyebrows rise slightly, Marcus had already decided. He would return to this diner, not as the tech billionaire whose divorce had made headlines, but as someone society overlooked. He would discover whether Rachel's compassion extended beyond convenient moments, whether genuine kindness could still exist in a world that had taught him to trust no one. If you are enjoying the story till now, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It costs you nothing, but for us, especially in these early days, it means the world. Let's continue. 3 days of careful preparation transformed Marcus Shaw from Silicon Valley Titan to Invisible Man. He traded his tailored suits for threadbare clothes from a second-hand store, let his usual precise grooming give way to stubble, and practiced the art of making himself smaller, less noticeable. The final touch was a worn military jacket, a calculated choice that would explain both his bearing and his pride. The morning he returned to the Golden Corner Diner, storm clouds threatened rain. He'd chosen Tuesday deliberately, historically the slowest day for restaurants, when his presence would be most noticeable but least intrusive. His hands, soft from years of boardroom battles rather than physical labor, were carefully dirtied. The limp he affected was subtle, a soldier's old wound rather than a beggar's plea for sympathy. Rachel was wiping down the counter when he entered, the same quiet grace in her movements he'd noticed before. She looked up, and for a heart-stopping moment Marcus feared recognition, but her eyes held only that same gentle warmth he'd observed with other customers. "Coffee?" she offered, already reaching for a cup. The casual kindness in her voice made his practiced story stick in his throat. I don't have," he began, letting vulnerability seep into his voice. "First cups on the house," Rachel replied smoothly. "It's chilly out there." She poured the coffee with the same care she'd shown the business executives last week. Cream or sugar? The interaction was the first test passed. No pity, no condescension, just simple human dignity. Marcus wrapped his hands around the warm cup, noting how she'd chosen one of the newer mugs rather than the chipped ones he'd seen given to other charity cases. "You're new here," she said. Not a question, but an invitation to share if he wished. "I'm Rachel." "John," he replied, the alias chosen for its plain anonymity. Just passing through." Her eyes flickered to his jacket, noting the military bearing he purposely hadn't quite hidden. "Well, John, the kitchen made too much breakfast today. Would you like to help us avoid waste?" It became a daily ritual. Marcus would arrive each morning and Rachel would find some excuse to provide a meal. Some days it was extra breakfast. Others, she'd claim a customer had ordered and left without eating. She never made it feel like charity, never drew attention to her kindness. They began to talk during her breaks. Rachel would slide into the booth across from him, sometimes with her own cup of coffee, and they'd share stories. Marcus wove truth into his fiction. His foster care background, his trust issues, his sense of displacement in the world. Rachel listened with an attention that felt almost therapeutic. "You know," she said one morning, watching rain streak the windows, "most people think being invisible is the worst thing that can happen to you. But sometimes it lets you see things more clearly." The words hit too close to home. Marcus found himself sharing more truth than he'd intended, speaking of betrayals and losses, carefully stripped of identifying details but raw in their emotion. Other regulars began to accept his presence. Mr. Wu would nod greeting from the kitchen, occasionally emerging to share stories of his own journey from Hong Kong, of building a life from nothing. An elderly veteran named Mike, who nursed single cups of coffee for hours, started saving newspapers for John, sharing them with a gruff, "Thought you might want to keep up with the world." Rachel's kindness extended beyond food. She quietly connected Marcus with local resources, a shelter with open beds, a clinic that helped veterans, a job training program. He never took advantage of these offers, but each one was presented with such genuine care that his guilt grew alongside his admiration. The diner became a kind of sanctuary. Marcus watched Rachel navigate her world with grace and purpose. She knew every customer's story. The night shift nurses who needed their coffee extra strong, the young mother counting pennies for her children's breakfast, the businessman wrestling with depression behind his polished smile. Each received not just service, but recognition of their humanity. One morning, a suited man at the counter berated Rachel over slightly cold coffee. Before Marcus could intervene, he watched her handle the situation with a poise that spoke of deeper understanding. "I'm sorry you're having a rough day," she said simply, pouring fresh coffee. "Sometimes the little things feel biggest when everything else is falling apart." The man deflated, his anger dissolving into unexpected tears. Rachel quietly moved him to a corner booth, away from curious eyes, and later Marcus overheard fragments of conversation about divorce papers and custody battles. During quiet moments, Rachel would share her own philosophy of life, never preaching but simply living her truth. "Money, status, power, they're all just costumes people wear," she said once, absently folding napkins. "What matters is what you do in the moments when you think no one's watching." The irony of her words wasn't lost on Marcus. Each interaction peeled away layers of his cynicism, replacing them with something more dangerous: hope. Hope that genuine goodness could exist without agenda, that connection could be real rather than transactional. He found himself extending his own quiet helps, sharing his newspaper with other customers, offering his dryer booth to a rain-soaked student, warning Rachel when dishes were too hot to handle bare-handed. These small acts of care, performed from behind his mask of poverty, felt more genuine than any of his corporate philanthropic gestures. But with each passing day, the weight of his deception grew heavier. Rachel's authenticity made his artifice feel increasingly cruel. The truth hovered constantly at the edge of his tongue, held back only by his deep need to believe that her kindness wasn't another performance in a world of masks. The morning everything unraveled began like any other. Rachel's regulars occupied their usual spots, Mike with his newspaper in the corner, the morning shift nurses grabbing coffee before their rounds, and John nursing his usual cup while reading yesterday's business section. The routine had become so natural that Rachel almost missed the sharp-dressed man who entered, his designer shoes clicking against the linoleum. Almost, but not quite. Something about him seemed familiar, though she couldn't place it. He scanned the diner with the practiced eye of someone used to assessing rooms, his gaze settling on John with an expression that made Rachel's instincts prickle. "Well, well," the man announced, his voice carrying deliberately across the quiet diner. "Marcus Shaw, playing homeless. Now, this is rich." The coffee pot nearly slipped from Rachel's hands. She turned slowly, looking between the man she'd known as John and the newcomer. John, no. Marcus had gone perfectly still, his face a mask of contained emotion. "James," he said quietly, "you shouldn't be here." "Shouldn't I?" James Chen, Marcus's oldest friend and board member, spread his hands theatrically. "When I followed you here last week, I thought maybe you were having some kind of breakdown. But this method acting as a homeless vet to, what, study the lower classes?" The diner had gone silent. Rachel stood frozen, fragments of conversation replaying in her mind with devastating new context. Every story he'd shared, every moment of seeming vulnerability, all carefully crafted lies. "That's not what this is," Marcus started to say, but James cut him off. The great Marcus Shaw, tech billionaire and humanitarian of the year, slumming it for what? Market research? A social experiment? Or just getting off on playing savior to the masses? James's laugh was cruel. "Did you know," he addressed Rachel directly, "that while he's been playing poor, he just closed a $100 million deal?" Rachel's face burned with humiliation. How many times had she slipped him extra food, worried about him going hungry? How many resources had she shared, thinking she was helping someone in need? All those conversations about struggle and survival? Had he been laughing at her the whole time? But James wasn't finished. His eyes narrowed as he studied Rachel more closely. "Wait a minute. Rachel Chen? David Chen's daughter?" He barked out another laugh. "Oh, this is perfect. The billionaire's daughter playing waitress while daddy's millions sit in offshore accounts. You two deserve each other." The room spun. Rachel gripped the counter for support as her carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. Marcus had half risen from his booth, his face ashen. "Rachel, I can explain." "Don't." The word came out sharper than any knife in Mr. Wu's kitchen. "Just don't." Mr. Wu emerged from the kitchen, his weathered face dark with anger. "I think you gentlemen should leave." "Gentlemen?" James sneered. "Oh no, there's nothing gentlemanly about this little charade." "Tell me, Rachel, does the old man know who you really are? That you're the daughter of the man who tried to destroy his business?" "Enough!" Marcus's voice cracked like thunder. "This is between us, James. Leave her out of it." But the damage was done. Rachel saw the shock on Mr. Wu's face, the betrayal in the eyes of her regulars. 3 years of building trust, of trying to make amends for her father's sins, shattered in moments. "Miss Rachel?" Mr. Wu's voice was barely a whisper. "Is this true?" She couldn't lie. Not now, not to him. "Yes," she managed. "My father. He was David Chen. But everything else, my job here, my care for this place, for all of you, that was real." "Real?" Marcus stood fully now, his homeless disguise incongruous with his straight bearing and clear voice. "Like my feelings for you were real? Rachel, I started this as a test, yes. But what grew between us?" "Grew between us?" Rachel's laugh held no humor. "What grew between us was a garden of lies. You tested my kindness like it was some kind of social experiment. You watched me help you, worry about you, care about you, all while sitting on billions." The morning light through the windows felt harsh now, exposing every shadow they'd both tried to hide. The diner's other customers sat in uncomfortable silence, witnesses to the collapse of not one but two carefully constructed facades. "I think," Mr. Wu said quietly, "that we need to close early today." Rachel untied her apron with trembling fingers. "That won't be necessary. I quit." "Rachel, please." Marcus took a step toward her, but she held up a hand. "You wanted to test whether genuine kindness exists in this world? Congratulations on your research, Mr. Shaw. I hope the data proves valuable for your next corporate presentation." She walked out of the diner into the bright morning, leaving behind the comfort of her chosen identity. Behind her, she could hear Marcus calling her name, could hear James's mocking laughter, could imagine the whispers already starting among her regular customers. Her phone buzzed, a news alert about Marcus Shaw's latest tech innovation. The photo showed him in an expensive suit, wearing the confident smile of a man who controlled his world. She thought of all the times he'd sat across from her in borrowed clothes, sharing stories of hardship and survival. Each memory now felt tainted, twisted into something ugly by deception. The irony wasn't lost on her, both of them hiding their wealth, playing roles they'd chosen for different reasons. But her deception had been an act of penance, an attempt to make amends for wealth built on others' pain. His had been… what? A game? A psychological experiment? She walked for hours, her comfortable waitress shoes carrying her through familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. Every security camera, every sleek office building, every piece of technology seemed to mock her with Marcus Shaw's influence. Had he been watching her all along, gathering data on the human condition from his ivory tower? When she finally returned to her modest apartment, the one connection to her true identity she'd allowed herself, there were already dozens of missed calls, messages from Marcus, from Mr. Wu, from regular customers who'd found her number. Even one from James Chen, probably calling to twist the knife further. She ignored them all, sitting instead in the growing darkness of her living room. On her coffee table sat the journal where she'd documented every person she'd helped, every small act of restitution for her father's crimes. Now, she wondered, had Marcus kept a similar journal? Had her genuine attempts at redemption been nothing more than data points in his social experiment? The truth was a double-edged sword, she realized. They had both sought authenticity while wearing masks. Both tried to prove something about human nature while hiding their own. But intentions mattered. She'd chosen her path to heal wounds. He'd chosen his to test boundaries. As night fell over the city, Rachel Chen, waitress, heiress, daughter of a fallen titan, faced the ruins of her carefully constructed life and wondered if there was anything left to salvage from the wreckage of truth. The diner felt wrong without Rachel. In the week following the revelation, Marcus watched from across the street as the morning regulars came and went, their routines disrupted by her absence. Mr. Wu had hired a new waitress, efficient, professional, but lacking the soul Rachel had brought to the place. Even the coffee seemed bitter now. He'd tried everything to reach her. Letters returned unopened, calls unanswered, emails unread. The irony wasn't lost on him. A tech billionaire unable to connect with someone who'd once shared coffee with him every morning. His PR team suggested damage control when photos of his homeless adventure leaked to the press, but Marcus shut them down immediately. He wouldn't turn this into another corporate narrative. James's betrayal cut deep, but not as deep as the look in Rachel's eyes that morning. His oldest friend had exposed him out of spite, angry that Marcus had rejected his latest scheme to monetize user data. "You've gone soft," James had sneered afterward. "All this time playing poor has made you forget who you are." But that was just it. Marcus wasn't sure who he was anymore. The masks had become tangled, the lines between performance and truth blurred. He found himself missing not just Rachel, but John's simple life. The freedom to exist without expectations, to help without agenda, to connect without suspicion. The truth about Rachel's identity had shocked him at first, but the more he thought about it, the more he understood. They'd both been seeking redemption in their own ways. His deception had been a test. Hers had been penance. The difference shamed him. Mike, the elderly veteran who'd shared his newspapers, caught Marcus outside the diner one morning. "You really messed up, son," he said, his voice gruff with disappointment. "But not for the reasons you think." "I never meant to hurt her," Marcus began. But Mike cut him off. "This ain't about hurt feelings. It's about trust. Rachel built something real here. Every cup of coffee, every kind word, it was her way of putting good back into a world her father had damaged. You took that truth and turned it into a research project." The words stung because they were right. Marcus had approached human connection like a tech problem to be solved, a hypothesis to be tested. Rachel had simply lived it, day by day, moment by moment. He found himself walking the city's streets, past the shelter where Rachel had tried to find him a bed, past the veterans center she'd recommended, past the job training program she'd told him about. At each stop, he heard stories about her. Small kindnesses, quiet help offered without fanfare. She hadn't just been playing a role, she'd been building a community. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mr. Wu called Marcus to the diner after closing one night, his lined face solemn in the dim light. "She's been helping people for 3 years," the old man said, setting a cup of coffee in front of Marcus. "Not just here. Everywhere her father's business touched, she's been trying to heal the damage. The diner was just part of it." "I didn't know," Marcus said quietly. "No, you didn't bother to know. You were too busy with your experiment." Mr. Wu's words were harsh, but his tone held a hint of sympathy. "But maybe you learned something real anyway." Marcus stared into his coffee, remembering all the mornings Rachel had poured it for him. "I learned that authenticity isn't something you can test for. It's something you have to live." "Good," Mr. Wu nodded. "Now the question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" The answer came to Marcus slowly, then all at once. He spent the next week tracing the path of Rachel's quiet acts of redemption. He found small businesses her father had ruined, now quietly supported by anonymous investments. He discovered community programs secretly funded by offshore accounts. Everywhere he looked, he saw the invisible thread of her influence, weaving healing through the fabric of the city. Using his tech skills, he began to map these connections, creating a digital tapestry of positive impact. Each thread led to another, revealing a pattern of intentional kindness that humbled him. Rachel hadn't just been serving coffee. She'd been serving hope, one cup at a time. The regular customers noticed the change in him. Gone was the arrogance of the tech titan, replaced by something quieter, more genuine. He started coming to the diner as himself, no disguise, no pretense, sitting quietly in his old booth, learning to listen rather than analyze. When the local veterans shelter faced closure, Marcus didn't swoop in with a flashy donation. Instead, he spent weeks working with the community, understanding their needs, finding sustainable solutions. He learned from Rachel's example, help offered with dignity, change created through connection. James tried to spin the situation in the press, painting Marcus as unstable, unfit to lead. But for the first time in his career, Marcus didn't care about the stock price or public opinion. He had glimpsed something real in that diner, something that mattered more than market cap or user metrics. "She's been spotted at St. Mary's Hospital," Mike told him one morning, sliding the newspaper across the counter. "Volunteering in the children's ward, still trying to heal the world, just somewhere else." Marcus nodded, understanding the gift of information for what it was, a chance at redemption, if he was brave enough to take it. The children's ward at St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with afternoon activity when Marcus finally found the courage to visit. He heard Rachel's laugh before he saw her, warm and genuine, floating down the sterile hallway. She sat cross-legged on the floor, reading to a group of young patients, her waitress uniform replaced by hospital volunteer scrubs. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Here she was, still giving, still healing, still authentic. She looked up as his shadow fell across the doorway, her smile fading into something more complex. "Mr. Shaw," she said quietly, marking her place in the book. Corporate espionage getting boring. The children looked between them curiously as Rachel stood, smoothing her scrubs with dignity. "Let's talk outside," she suggested, professional mask firmly in place. In the hallway, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as they faced each other. Marcus spoke first, determined to get the words right. "I've spent weeks trying to craft the perfect apology," he began, "but everything I wrote sounded like another performance. So, here's the truth. You showed me what genuine goodness looks like, and I turned it into a case study. I'm not here to defend that." Rachel's expression remained carefully neutral. "Then why are you here?" "Because you taught me something I couldn't learn in any boardroom. Real change doesn't happen through observation. It happens through participation." He handed her a tablet, opened to a web page. Rachel's eyes widened as she scrolled through what he'd been working on. The Golden Corner Diner Initiative, a program providing interest-free loans and business support to small restaurants affected by predatory lending. The first recipient, Mr. Wu, with full ownership rights and expansion support. "This isn't about publicity," Marcus continued as she read. "There's no press release, no corporate branding, just quiet help offered with dignity. I learned that from you." "You're using your real name," Rachel noted, still scrolling. "Yes, no more masks. The program's oversight board includes Mike from the diner, 2 local business owners, and representatives from the community. I'm just the funding source. They make the decisions." Rachel handed back the tablet, her fingers trembling slightly. "Why show me this?" "Because you deserve to know that your kindness wasn't wasted, even on someone who didn't deserve it. The lessons I learned watching you, they're creating real change now." He told her about James's attempted corporate takeover, about choosing to stand firm on ethical data practices even when it cost him board support. He shared stories of working with the veterans shelter, of learning to listen instead of analyze, of understanding that true worth couldn't be measured in market shares. "The diner misses you," he said finally. "We all do, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because you deserve to know that your impact goes beyond what you can see. You changed me, Rachel, not because you were part of an experiment, but because you were simply, authentically yourself." Rachel was quiet for a long moment, watching nurses and doctors pass by in the busy hallway. Finally, she spoke. "Did you know my father never visited kids in hospitals? He donated millions for new wings, new equipment, always with his name prominently displayed. But he never sat with the children, never read them stories, never saw the real impact of his choices." She turned to face him fully. "The money in those offshore accounts, I've been using it to fix what he broke, not through grand gestures, but through small moments of healing. Every day in that diner was part of my redemption." "I know," Marcus said softly. "I followed the thread of your kindness across the city. Each story led to another, each act of help connected to more. You've been quietly rebuilding what greed tore down." A child's laugh echoed from the ward, breaking the tension. Rachel's professional mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of the warmth he remembered from their morning coffee conversations. "You hurt me," she said simply, "not just with the deception, but by making me doubt the authenticity of our connection. I know, and I can't undo that, but I can show you, through actions rather than words, that what grew between us was real, even if it started from artificial ground." Rachel glanced at her watch. "Story time's not over. I should get back." Marcus nodded, accepting the dismissal, but as he turned to leave, Rachel spoke again. "The diner serves the best coffee in the city on Tuesday mornings, in case you're interested in a cup. No disguise needed." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an opening, a chance to build something new on a foundation of truth rather than testing. As Marcus walked through the hospital corridors, he realized that sometimes the greatest wealth lay not in what you could gain, but in what you were willing to risk losing in pursuit of something real. 1 year later, the Golden Corner Diner hummed with familiar morning energy. Mr. W's ownership had brought subtle changes. New equipment in the kitchen, restored vintage fixtures, a small herb garden in the window. But the soul of the place remained unchanged. Rachel moved between tables with her usual grace, now wearing both her waitress apron and the quiet confidence of someone fully at peace with her truth. Marcus sat in his usual booth, no longer testing or observing, but simply being. Their reconciliation had come slowly, built on actions rather than words. The diner had become the headquarters for their shared mission, a place where wealth met wisdom, where corporate power bowed to community needs. The Second Chance Foundation, jointly led by Rachel and Marcus, operated from a small office upstairs. Their combined resources and experiences created a unique approach to community renewal. Rachel's understanding of personal impact merged with Marcus's tech innovation, creating systems that preserved dignity while providing help. Their marriage certificate hung beside Mr. WU's new ownership papers, both documents testifying to the power of truth over pretense. "Coffee's getting cold," Rachel teased, sliding into the booth across from Marcus. She'd kept her morning shifts, insisting that real change happened face-to-face, one conversation at a time. Marcus had learned to listen rather than solve, to support rather than direct. James, after a public apology and genuine reform, now helped vet tech companies for ethical practices. Mike led the veteran outreach program, his gruff wisdom guiding a new generation of community leaders. The diner had become a model for similar programs across the city, places where wealth and want could meet as equals, where masks could be shed in favor of authentic connection. "Remember when you thought kindness needed testing?" Rachel asked, her eyes twinkling. Marcus smiled, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I remember learning that real wealth isn't something you can count," he replied. "It's something you create together." Outside, the morning sun gilded the city's streets, shining on both the sleek office towers and the humble storefronts. Inside the Golden Corner Diner, two people who had hidden behind masks of poverty and privilege now stood revealed in the simple light of truth, serving hope alongside coffee, one cup at a time. Please leave your opinion in the comments about this amazing story.